Welcome back. This is Daybreak, and thank you for staying with us. The hashtag on X is Citizen Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. So let's proceed with talking about the climate conference. And they have been on since 1992. And the progress has been made at a nice pace nonetheless. However, for some countries, attending these conferences has yielded empty promises and inaction, according to the United Nations. Developing countries like Kenya will not be impressed. And you know why? Biggest polluters like China, the United States, and alongside India and other 27 countries that make up the European Union will not be there, at least for the first few days of the conference in Baku in Azerbaijan. In Dubai last year, the agreement reached was to transition away from fossil fuel, which was historic by all standards. So when conferences do happen, there is an overwhelming focus on the magic number, which is 1.5 degrees Celsius, and which is the level of global surface warming, the pre-industrial level that all countries aspire to achieve as agreed upon following the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. And that has not been achieved. In fact, not a single country on the planet is on track to achieve this. However, all countries in the world, Kenya is among the few ranking high in attaining this. Here is how. This is because of our renewable energy supplies and forests and commercialization of carbon offsets. It's two legislative measures adopted by Kenya to reduce carbon emissions. And this has been made possible because Kenya is not one of the big polluting countries. Remember, developing nations like Kenya require at least $1 trillion to overcome the consequences of climate change. According to the United Nations, the 2024, which is the year we are in, is on track to become the hottest ever recorded. And scientists say that countries are playing a catch-up game to the calamities of climate change. So we get back to our panelists who are in studio with us to get more on the questions around what then needs to happen to fix this because of the absence of the big polluters and as well as the measures needed, these COP conferences, what they yield and the benefits for countries like Kenya who will be going into that with the commitments that they look forward to from the climate conference. Amos, looks interesting if you look at the big polluters and the tons of carbon that they emit and their notable absence. And do you think it will be a case of deja vu, the perpetual continuity of mechanisms but no commitment out of the COP29 climate conference?
Yeah, like you mentioned, it's not new. Immediately after Kyoto Protocol, we had the U.S. backtracking again when the new government came in place in 2001. We were hoping U.S. to take leadership on that. After Paris in 2016, we had also the same happening with the U.S. and same is still happening this year. Just before Baku, we had U.S. elections and we had a new president come in who is a climate denier. So the thing is, in as much as we have mechanisms such as carbon markets, regulations coming in place on the first day, I don't think we can use the same tactics that got us into this challenge as solutions. I'm very skeptical about carbon markets helping us achieve climate solution. This is actually a way of transferring responsibility from polluters to the victims of their pollution. When you look at carbon markets mechanisms, they do not help us stop the emissions. They do not help communities achieve development. We have had this market-based scheme since Kyoto Protocol in 1997. And what is our experience? Our experience is carbon markets are a distraction to us finding real solutions. And I hope that as part of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, carbon markets are not presented as part of climate finance because they do not provide us with real solutions.
Okay, for developing nations like Kenya, is that in your view then a distraction away from the real issues that ought to be discussed to offset the consequences of climate change?
Exactly. The thing is, countries like Kenya haven't contributed to the problem. Why would you transfer responsibility to them of cutting emissions? Actually, we do not have emissions to cut here. What we have here is to avoid future emissions. And that's why we are calling on the global players that, look, even if you cut emissions in your own country and leave us, behind and leave us, our economies dependent on fossil fuels, you are not solving the problem. We all of us to have move collectively in a collective action. And since we do not have much resources to invest in the potential that we have in terms of renewables and all that, that's why we need this international cooperation, a framework that is going to make available these resources for Kenya to invest in its renewables, to invest in its arable land for food sovereignty, for energy sovereignty, to help its people, Kenyan people and African people, to be able to overcome the challenges presented to them by the climate impact.
Yeah, and Cecilia, certainly Kenya is not among the big polluting countries, but it has committed to use its forest, renewable energy supplies, and has commercialized carbon offsets. It appears that there is more commitment on the part of the countries that are facing the consequences than those who are the big polluters.
Yeah, actually, Kenya has a very impressive track record in terms of their response to climate change. I think we have a very robust plan. We have very robust policies in place, particularly in the energy sector, as you said, even though our contribution to the crisis is very small. One of the exercises I do every time the COP is nearing, based on my role, is to monitor particularly how many G20 countries are committing to attend the COP. And this year we have 8 out of the G20 countries, that are dubbed to if they made real commitments, would be able to at least get close to the target. And one of the other questions that one asks, whether the UN global convened conference, this climate change conference, is actually working, and who is it working for? And I think that's a critical question for us to look at. I think Bob has said, is it our responsibility as developing countries, to continue making these efforts? Do we have to get involved in the carbon markets? But I think it's our responsibility. We are making progress, and we need a collective approach, and the multilateral process offers us that collective approach to sit, to negotiate, to agree on action, and to create those enabling frameworks that would allow us to make progress. So I think it's important that we continue to encourage even those countries that are not contributing much, because they will face the impact, to continue engaging with those that need to increase their ambition. And that's basically what's going to be happening around the corridors here. The issue of trust is critical. And I'd just like to go back again to the finance question. The issue of finance is important, and the trillions will be important. But I think fundamentally what we would like to see is increased investments. It's increased investments in us achieving that tripling of renewable energy. And where are those investments going to come from? And what's our level of absorption of that capacity, whether the trillions are there, but if we do not have plans. And one of the focus areas that we will be having here in Baku, and as we prepare to go to Berlin next year, is to ensure that countries are going to develop robust, nationally determined contributions. These are the NDC frameworks, which are expected to be more ambitious, more economy-wide, and be able to attract the investments that we require to address that problem. And a needs-based approach will need to be informed by these kind of plans that really start talking to where fundamentally the challenges and the problems are, and where we need to leverage, whether it's technology or whether it's capacity, to be able to deal with this problem. So back to the multilateral process. Yes, we need to have the G20 countries here in Baku. As I mentioned, we have only 8 out of the 21 members of the G20, and it's critical. We have seen the geopolitical landscape changing. This COP is happening at a very fragile time, when we know that one of our big party members, one of the parties that are very critical to the process, the geopolitics changing there. But this should not kill the spirit of wanting us to find not only a level playing field, but to find a landscape that allows us to put the issues on the table, and whether we are talking about just transition, doubling adaptation, dealing with the fundamental challenges that we're facing with this crisis, and trying to see how we come up with a robust outcome out of Baku. But it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be tough. We're already experiencing how tough it was on the first day, but I'm hopeful that even given this geopolitical landscape shifts, that we may be able to reach a good resolution.
And Cecilia, talking about the group of countries of the G20, certainly no Joe Biden, certainly no Emmanuel Macron, certainly no Olaf Scholz, and you can attribute the political landscape in Europe to some of the absenteeism. And no parties are looking forward to Donald Trump to commit America to this climate cause, certainly. Then you mentioned it's a difficult or a challenging period. How then would it be even further challenging or an exacerbation of this challenge, given that on 20th of January, Donald Trump will officially be taking the oath of office to be the next president of the biggest economy, which has a crucial input into these climate discussions through its finances?
You know, this is really a testing time for the multilateral process, because, you know, we look at the balance in terms of how the negotiations are taking place, in terms of how responsive and how much trust can be built. And you always, when I'm in the conference room, I will be observing and seeing what kind of decisions are being made and how one side is trying to balance with the other. So it's going to be a very delicate weeks. This week we focus more on concretizing what at the technical level needs to be done, whether it's on carbon markets, whether it's on just transition. And next week, as we transition to the political part of the COP, where crucial decisions and commitments are expected to be made, I think that will be a time to start watching how things will be, will be evolving. Okay. So for me, this week may not be very difficult technically. I think we have a very technical, sound, robust conversation across all areas. But the testing time, when real political decisions will have to be made, when we will have to agree on this new target on finance, when they will need to reach an agreement also comprehensively on the carbon markets, where we will be able to see how this geopolitical shift will impact on the response to climate crisis. Yeah. Thank you.
Moses, coming to you. All the speakers yesterday had pointed that this must be the different climate conference. They meant Baku 29. Do you think it bears all the indications and the hallmarks that it will yield different outcome?
Well, it's the beginning of a good conversation. Earlier on, you had expressed concerns about whether we will come out with commitments and then find a situation where we're making 2 steps forward and maybe a step backwards, as it has been previously. And I think maybe at some point we now have to start having a conversation about going back to where, tracing our steps back to where the rain started beating us, and going back to the UNFCCC framework and the manner in which state obligations have been structured, because the high emitting states are taking advantage of their voluntary obligations and the pace through which they can implement them to keep having this back and forth with their commitments. And that's why it is essential to go back to looking into trying to have a framework that has more binding obligations, such that the high emitters don't trace back their steps. And even though it is quite, there is some optimism with the engagement of the private sector, I think the private sector also counts so much on solid commitments of state obligations in order for them to put their money where those obligations are. So if we don't go back and solidify that basis, then we might have a problem. Academics and a few experts attribute this to what they call a bottom-up approach in the UNFCCC framework, where we are achieving certain goals, but depending on objectives and commitments that states have to make and implement at their own paces, as opposed to starting from a point of having binding obligations and now states being held accountable to that. And that's why the conversation that we are starting in the COP29 is trying to have more defined commitments, more defined obligations. And I think it might get us somewhere, but truth is we also have to trace our steps back and see where the rain started visiting us.
Yeah. Dr. Stephen, one critical question remains. How does then the world prepare, or is the world prepared for climate refugees?
Oh, my goodness. I think we are seeing more people displaced in the world this year than ever before, or certainly since the Second World War. Both refugees and internally displaced people and migrants. And climate change is a massive part of that. Kenya, once again, leading the pack with a very progressive law on the books, the Refugee Act, and with the Shirika transition that is planned so that we unite the interests of refugees and host populations. That's a model that needs to be copied elsewhere in the world. And I don't think, to answer your question, that the developed countries are really attuned yet to quite what a displacement challenge this is also going to be. Which takes us really to the point that, to use an old cliche, failure is not an option for COP29. We cannot afford to fail. You already said in one of your voiceovers that we're on target to have the hottest year ever recorded in 2024. We are perilously close now to going beyond that 1.5 degree limit that you've mentioned. And the thing about that limit is it's, as we say, non-linear. It sounds like a minor difference, 1.5 versus 2 degrees versus 3 degrees versus 4 degrees. It's not minor. It's cataclysmic. If we go to 2 degrees or 3, and the outer estimates that UNEP, the Environment Programme, has made is that we're on target already for 2 to 3% increase in global warming, 2 to 3 degrees increase. That will precipitate waves of displacement of refugees and migrants like we've never seen before. So failure isn't an option, and that's where I come back to Kenya's role and Africa's role. We've all said the leadership of the G20 is to some extent absent this time round. It's all the more important that the African continent, and led by Kenya as the head of the African group of negotiators, has this really powerful moral voice that forces my part of the world to wake up and listen. It isn't too late for that yet, but it's perilously close. So failure is not an option.
Yeah, and to bring this discussion back home, this is because there's the two sides of the climate question here. It rains, then the infrastructure is damaged, no accessibility to areas, especially in the north because of the poor road network. And lack of water causes drought, still displaces people, rain displaces people. And Kenya, despite all these commitments and legislations that are friendly in the cause of climate change, doesn't bear the same financial capacity, say, for example, a Scandinavian country. I mean, how then can Kenya and other countries be helped out of this double tragedy situation?
One of the frustrations that I have as the UN resident coordinator here in Kenya, and also, by the way, what we call the humanitarian coordinator, so when the drought hits, is looking at a 3-year historic drought like we'd never seen before, topping out at nearly 6 million people in deep food insecurity, and then moving the very next season into these historic rains and thinking, if only we could capture that water. And you know, there are low-tech, low-cost solutions. I'm going to be going down to Makueni in the next couple of weeks to look at what we call sand dams, which are a very low-tech way of trapping some of that water. We've got to shift from investing in the emergency response to shifting to building what we call resilience, helping communities adapt and get more resilient to this climate emergency that is already with us concretely in Kenya. The technology is there to do it, but it is, you're right, it's about the finance challenge. And I think we've got to help Kenya make provision for that in its own budgets, because I'm not seeing the generosity of the international partners coming through to help Kenya make those steps.
Yeah, and Cecilia, certainly we'll be getting to Cecilia, the director of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She's joining us from Baku. We'll be getting hold of her shortly. But Amos, in the short term, we talked about the finances, and the commitment is pretty much a difficulty here. But what are the short-term measures that can be deployed and which can prove effective before these finances come in? The talk seems to be lengthened, but what do you think are the measures which can be deployed in the short term?
Yeah, there is need for locally led climate action. When you look in the country, We have communities that have practices that have been helping them build resilience to incidents such as droughts and all that. So these practices need to be invested in terms of budgeting. When you look at the budgets that go into supporting, for example, agriculture, they're still very low. Our government needs to allocate more resources to communities to be able to help them build resilience. But also, we have a loss and damage fund that was operationalized last year in Dubai. Mm-hmm. But that fund is still an empty shell.
Yes.
When you look at the commitments that have been made by historical polluters, right now we are at $700 million that have been pledged into the fund. But this money have not been disbursed yet. It's taking too long for this money to be dispersed. So such kind of funds need to be made operational. And I hope that this COP is going to help us come up with a mechanism that will fully operationalize the loss and damage fund, but also move beyond the crumbs that are thrown into such funds. Because when it was first operationalized last year, we had countries such as US only pledging 17 million into the fund. Yeah. This year, at the beginning of COP29, we had Sweden pledge 19 million, and that is celebrated. I think we need to really have historical polluters, developed countries, commit funds into these schemes that are commensurate to the needs of our communities. When you look at $700 million, for example, to be shared among developing countries to the communities on the front line of the crisis, that's a drop in the ocean. So we need commitments that are also commensurate with the needs of the communities. And communities also, we need to have mechanisms where communities on the front line of the crisis are able to easily access these funds without having to go through bureaucratic processes that might disadvantage them in the process of acquiring these funds to help them build resilience.
And I'll come to you, Dr. Stephen. Allow me to get hold of Cecilia for one more time. She has a very busy schedule there in Baku, Azerbaijan, and it's about time that their sessions for the day will be starting. Cecilia, again to you. One challenge is that the Loss and Adaptation Fund is under construction. Yes, we talk about the commitments here, but then in the short term, how key is it to incorporate other players in this climate call?
Yes, yesterday we witnessed the signing of the hosting of the Loss and Damage Fund. And I think this is still what I saw. I could feel the vibrancy in the room and the turnout was great. And I think there is a high expectation that this fund would be able to fill the gaps that the other existing climate funds are not doing. There is a great expectation, particularly from the vulnerable countries, from the small and island development states from Africa, that this fund could be transformational. But we know that it's still lacking in terms of its capacity, in terms of the volumes of funds that have been committed so far. And therefore, there is still a call to try and finance it. And I think the point that was made earlier, and we are hoping here on the corridors, that the multilateral development fund reforms will still be an alive discussion that will find its way into the negotiation rooms and a recommitment for that. But before I leave, I just want to mention here that we will require very, very bold leadership from the developing world. We will require the Africa group of negotiators that's led by Kenya at the moment to be bold and to be able to make the right demands, but also be able to have compromises in terms of ensuring that even in areas where we are not reaching compromise, particularly when it comes to the quantum, that on the other side, that we are really making some commitments that the resources that are being made available will find their way into the right areas that require support, and that will be transformational to our people and our communities. I think we need to be bold. As we make demands, let's also ensure that the frameworks, our governance structures, and the way we allocate resources are attuned to ensuring that we are also doing our things in the right way. So that's what I'll be looking for balance and for bold leadership. And I hope that as you monitor this progress, I'll be able to come back again after 2 weeks to say that we got to the right place that we needed to be, having come to Baku. The response in Baku has been positive. We have over 75,000 people coming to the conference, and that's a positive signal. So we are really hopeful that we get some strong outcomes. Thank you.
Yeah, Cecilia, and given that the Kenya will be chairing the African group of negotiators, how then will their call here? Because it appears that the climate risk for Kenya and Africa is more real, resources are not commensurate to the problems, and the commitments are disappointingly very glaring. How then does this conversation need to happen on a table where on the other end you have the big polluters who have not adhered to the call for the financial commitments, and who to some extent to them this is a non-issue, or even they don't think the climate change topic is even a matter of relevance to them and their people?
Yeah, this is the reality of the multilateral process and the need for continued purpose of building trust. I think, we cannot continue just saying that we won't take action because we are not getting the trillions that are needed. I think there are actions that we can take that would ensure that our people, that our community continue to be, sustainable, can be able to respond, we reduce vulnerabilities. But of course, on the other hand, I'm saying yes, the demands must be there. But they should be not only in a consensus building process, in a trust building process, but fundamentally, the negotiators who are here must find ways of building bridges, because unless those bridges are built, we will continue on this track of making slow progress and not making progress because we polarize ourselves to north and south. And that polarization is actually not helpful. I'm looking forward to Baku being the place where this bridge is built and that we can find compromises, as we move towards, a great outcome.
Cecilia, thank you, and lovely having you here on the broadcast, and all the best in your other engagements for the day there in Baku, Azerbaijan. She was joining us from where the climate conference is happening. Dr. Stephen, you mentioned Makueni, and it bears a very proper relevance in this context that in 2021, when the county hosted the annual devolution conference, yes, it was themed multi-level governance for climate action. How far are we into that discussion and the commitments made at the county level for the common man, common person to understand this entire concept of what we are discussing here?
County level is really crucial, so let me just come to that. But just one quick point on the loss and damages fund that Amos and then Cecilia were talking about. It was a major breakthrough at the last COP that we even got the establishment of the fund. It was the recognition or the acceptance by the rich countries for the first time that they needed to accept responsibility for loss and damages. But it's tiny. This $700 million figure, it sounds like a lot of money, but one comparison, in the 3-year drought that we had between 2021 and 2024, the Kenyan government's estimate of just the cost of the livestock lost in that 3-year drought was $1 billion. So that's already bigger for one country. For one 3-year event than the entire fund. But it's a start, and we have to build on it. At the county level, you're absolutely right, Ayob. And, also Amos was talking about that, about local action. So moving the level of action down to the county levels, I think there's a lot of energy, a lot of creativity, a lot of determination. I think it's at the county level that you really see the climate emergency biting. That's of course true, particularly in the ASAL counties, but not exclusively there. It's all over Kenya that we're seeing this problem. In fact, it was Western Kenya that was hit quite hard at one point in the flooding. It was Nairobi most recently. I think the challenge, of course, is the tightness of the financial position at the national level, which is also resulting in a tightness at the county level. So we need those resources available. I would say it is at the county level that we really need to have that discussion about concrete actions, about promoting resilience. So things like sand dams, things like rehabilitating boreholes, all of this for drought. But also, I mean, just before we came on air, we heard President Ruto talking about the Nairobi Rivers Commission, right? Cleaning up the river, but also making sure that we have flood protections around it. All of this kind of infrastructure work, it doesn't all have to cost massive amounts of money. There are low-tech, low-cost ways of doing it, and I think it's part of our collective responsibility to identify and prioritize those.
Yeah, and Amos, one major outcome of the November rains in last year was the damage it meted on infrastructure. And this seems to be holding back countries from the developing world from further development, is it, given that this is a climate, as a result of a climate action? And when you have no infrastructure, certainly there is inaccessibility to persons and regions that are completely cut off. How a bearing is this already on economies that are coming of age, where the middle class seems to be decimated?
Actually, climate crisis is rolling back the progress that many countries have really made in development. And this is not just uniquely in Kenya, but across the world. Right now, even countries that thought that they are resilient to the climate crisis, we are seeing them suffer the impacts of the crisis. And if anyone needed convincing that we need to take urgent climate action, I don't think they need to look very far. We are having floods even in places such as New York. So even developed countries are vulnerable, becoming vulnerable to the climate crisis as these impacts become more extreme. And look, this is only happening when the world has warmed by 1.1, 1.2 degrees. Do you think if we were to surpass 2 degrees, we'd be having a world to live in? I don't think this world will be livable if we surpass 2 degrees or we hit those extremes that the science is warning us on. So the best way to adapt to the climate crisis is to mitigate. Those that bear historical responsibility have to cut their emissions as soon as possible and help countries such as Kenya to be able to develop in a pathway that is sustainable, in a pathway that does not put the world on a trajectory where we will have to be living shuttling between disasters, of which already we can see we are shuttling between disasters. And that's why we are calling for this international cooperation that is truthful, that is, we have countries through the spirit of common but differentiated responsibility, taking their own responsibility in cutting emissions in their own backyard, but also helping countries that have been hit by the climate impacts, of which they are not out of their own making, to build resilience. Rebuilding, for example, infrastructures that are destroyed. Okay. We need to have such a fund. And loss and damage fund is a fund that is going to help countries to be able to rebuild their livelihoods, rebuild things such as infrastructure. And that's why we are saying the cost of climate impact is too high. And it can only get higher if we are not going to take urgent action. But we need to first take urgent action cutting emissions, but also commit resources into helping economies such as Kenya that are suffering the impacts to be able to rebuild and establish resilience moving forward.
Yeah. Moses, given what happened in Spain recently, the deadly floods that had led to loss of lives, does the human cost here, which seems to be the common underpinning factor, the common denominator, whether the country is rich or one is in the developing world, does the human factor here in terms of the cost or the bearing it has on the loss of lives be a factor that needs to converge the parties in Baku, Azerbaijan, given that it has no status irrespective of how big an economy is, whether in Europe, in America, in Africa, or even in Australia?
Yes, it's true. The human factor plays quite a big role. We understand that even the extent to which we start having conversations about climate refugees is actually from a humanitarian perspective, where states are having conversations, or we are having conversations towards trying to accommodate persons who can't submit themselves to the protection of their states as a result of harsh and weather conditions that result from climate change. But to also just weigh in on the conversation we were having earlier about responsibilities or immediate action that can be taken at the national level, I think climate action obligations are quite vast. And when we look at adaptation and mitigation, the state can always play still a key role within the national level to mitigate the effects or the impact that we end up having. And while we are at it on the private sector, we can try to always lure them in. And it's important for the state to try and come up with policies that develop and design climate products that attract the private sector to invest in. And that can also take the form of corporate social responsibility, because we also have big corporations within low-emitting countries such as us. And even if you take it back to the loss and damage fund, we would realize that most of the countries that would benefit from it would be from small island countries or least developed countries. And you realize economies such as Kenya have already left the bracket of least developing countries and are in emerging market economies. And therefore, as much as we might also count on these financial commitments, it is still essential to try and complement them with national adjustments within the national policies that we have to for adaptation and mitigation as part of climate action. And
that includes the private sector?
That includes the private sector as well.
Yeah. Dr. Stephen, does the world need to change its view of the consequences of climate change, given that at times what the scientists say is questioned by parties in the polluting world? And look at it from this perspective, that if certain given persons are displaced from an area by floods, for example, even by drought, they have to move to another location, then possibly they could be unwelcome, or the resource on the other part is scarce, which then leads to conflict and further movement of people from one area to the other. Does that need to be a perspective which ought to be different to view this climate change as a factor that can lead to conflict across the world?
Yes. Does the world need to change its view? Yes. Those countries that are still in denial about climate change need to get real. But even those countries that are on message in the global north about the urgency of climate change, I think, need to go through a revolution in thought. They need to understand the complexity of the consequences, right? So what I mean is those countries that recognize the urgency of the climate emergency, but then don't necessarily understand fully the consequences of that, for example, for population movement, or for the production of conflict, or for the holding back of development. Amos, again, you spoke to that. It's costing Kenya about, we estimate, somewhere between 2 and 5% of its development to contend with the climate emergency. It's costing Kenya about 10% of its budget per annum to deal with the consequences of the climate emergency. So all of that is lost opportunity for Kenya. Now, Kenya is doing comparatively well, but you think of some of the countries that are being ravaged by war, that are also being ravaged by the climate emergency, and many of those countries, I hope you're quite right, are ones producing outwaves of climate refugees and climate migrants who are trying to cross the Mediterranean and come to the European Union. And there, forgive me, that's my continent, but I think there are countries that see that as, you know, what is this? What is this? What is this mass population movement? What is this invasion? It's a consequence of the climate emergency, pure and simple. And so that's, in a sense, that human wave is also part of the loss and damages, and is also something that even those countries that do recognize their part in creating the climate emergency, I think haven't completely grasped that this is also a consequence of that, and that they have a responsibility towards that humanitarian emergency that goes beyond the narrow confines of the climate crisis, if you like.
Yeah, and Amos, Africa needs about $1.3 trillion by 2030, and a significant portion of this will go to countries including Kenya. And of course, there are going to be other conferences in 6 years' time before 2030. Do you think this is achievable?
Yeah, the thing is, when you look at Africa right now, many countries are in debt distress. About 50% of African countries are in acute debt distress. And these resources are needed to be able to help these countries to be able to invest in systems that are going to help communities be resilient to the climate impacts. When you look at the debts that many African countries are facing right now, some of them have been brought about having to deal with the damages that are brought about by the climate crisis. You mentioned about the infrastructure. When we should be investing in our social services, such as education, healthcare, we are forced to redirect those resources into rebuilding the infrastructure. Recently, when we had floods in Nairobi, we had to recarpet our roads because they had been swept away by the waters. So the climate impacts is actually exacerbating the debt situation and further constraining the fiscal space on the African continent. And that's why, based on calculations, the Africa group of negotiators are asking for a 1.3 trillion as part of the quantum of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. What this means is these resources are meant to come into the continent. One, to help invest in adaptation measures. We've been talking about doubling adaptation finance since Paris Agreement, and this has not been achieved. When you look at the allocation of resources on climate action, most of it is privileges mitigation, emission cutting, but little goes into enabling communities to be able to be resilient. And that's why, as we discuss in COP29 in Baku, the new goal, we must have a sub-goal on adaptation that allocates resources actually to helping communities be resilient. There is another element of just transitions.
What does this resilience include, given that it has to happen at the very villages that we have across the country? Because in the end, it's the people who bear the consequence at that level.
Yeah, what resilient means is we must have available resources, for example, when droughts hit, that are going to be invested in infrastructure such as irrigation schemes that will help these communities to continue producing even when the rains fails, so that we do not have a situation where we are losing livelihoods, where communities are losing their livestock and all that. These farms can continue producing even when the rains fail with proper infrastructure in place. And these resources have to be allocated to the, we've talked about subnational levels. There is a new emerging leadership, like the Makueni County that was leading in the adaptation conversations. As states such as the US backtrack on their commitments, there is a new wave of optimism where we have subnational entities such as counties in Kenya. In the US, we have states, for example, taking up leadership and being able to provide these much needed resources for communities to be able to adapt.
And Moses, how much of this is largely leading to our own economic output, given that investments on climate change consequences is having a toll on the management of our own economy, yet we have obligations that we have to pay up for, including paying for debts. And here you have also a country, whilst it's on that course, also is paying up for the consequences of climate change. How much of a consequence is it largely having on the economies of the developing world?
I mean, it explains and account for the reason why we are dealing with both climate crisis and debt crisis at the same time. And that's why it is important to start having conversations behind re-engineering climate finance, where it's possible to at least be killing two birds with a stone, so that we are trying to ensure that we are dispensing our debt responsibility while also having access to sustainable development goals through climate finance. And that's why I agree with Amos when he was talking about the extent to which, as we re-engineer climate finance, then it's important that we come up with frameworks that are more concessional, so that we do not end up having it taking a debt approach, or even if that's the case, then it's more concessional with very lenient terms and repayment terms and so on, so that it doesn't send us back to the kind of crisis that we find ourselves in. And this is essential because it's already limiting the extent to which the government can focus on our socio-economic priorities, such as education and health, while at the same time trying to deal with climate finance disasters. And that's why it's still essential to try and push and still lobby movements and even civil society organizations to even try and change the perspectives of high emitters about the accepting the realities of climate change and trying to also neutralize the fight back by nationalism, because it's nationalism fighting back that leads into high emitters being in denial about the realities of climate change.
And should strict deadlines be or punishment be imposed, Dr. Stephen, given that some of these commitments have not been met post Paris Climate Accord? Then we had Glasgow, we had Sharm el-Sheikh, we had Dubai, and now we have Baku. Should there be some level of punishment or deadlines for this, the fund to work and the commitments to be met?
If I was dictator of the world, I would impose those punishments. Unfortunately, there's no mechanism for it. So our only alternative is to go the route that our colleagues have all been describing, to have faith in the multilateral process, and then to do, I think, what Moses was saying there, which is to have a loud voice coming from Kenya and from the African continent to point out the inconsistency. So put aside those countries that deny climate. There's nothing we can do about that for now. But those that are committed and recognise the problem and recognise the damage that has been done and recognise the quantum of financing that is needed to promote the adaptation that we're all talking about, and they say, we can't afford to give you that for free, we can't afford to give you that as aid or as loss and damages, so you're going to have to borrow it. Well, it would be perverse if then those were the same countries who were punishing Kenya and Africa for saying, well, you've borrowed too much. You've borrowed unsustainably, right? Which is also happening from another part of the international community. So we have to find a way to bring down the cost of capital. And that takes us back to Kenya's position, the Africa Climate Summit. Africa has all of the solutions that not just Africa needs, but that the world needs. Renewable energy, critical minerals, sustainable agriculture, carbon capture. So we need the capital affordably to bring those solutions to scale. And that's why this is the finance COP.
Yeah, and let's sample the feedback and get your final comments here on the broadcast. The hashtag on X has been Citizen Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikader. Here's what you're saying. And Sir Nixon Dugure says, I have heard time and again about climate finance to small businesses, and it's now at the heart of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP29. Who in Kenya is benefiting real time in this, or it's just another rhetorical game? Engineer Lazaro says Africa should face climate change with a collective approach through their AU Assembly. In fact, he says this should be the main agenda for the incoming African Union chairman after next year's elections. Babu Michael says, when it comes to climate funding by the big polluters, I feel it's still up to those most affected countries and needs these funds to formulate ways to curb pollution through climate projects, for example, so the funds can be directed to the projects. Remy Bhutia says Kiptapke Environmental CBO in Nandi County's unique approach involves a whole of society strategy engaging community groups, local authorities and the national government to rehabilitate key wetlands areas. And this is what you talked about, Dr. Stephen, given the relevance and the engagement of the community. And there was an example given there by one of our viewers there. And how then is this so significant, given that beyond the scope of understanding and comprehending these issues, which may be technical for the common persons across the world, that it gets to their level and engagement through CBOs, as mentioned here, from Nandi County?
So individuals can do a lot. I mean, first of all, we can make changes in our own lives. The consumption patterns we have, the amount of energy that we use, the pollution that we create. But over and above that, the power of the voice the power of ordinary Kenyans, reminding their government, but reminding the world that this is impacting their lives and their livelihoods. And I think, as we wind up, I want to finish with a note of optimism. I think that voice is starting to break through. Is it coming as quickly as we want or as we need? No. Is the process lagging behind? Yes. Are the commitments lagging behind the process? Yes. But is the global discussion changing slowly? Yes, in the right direction. I think the sense of urgency is starting to be heard. The Secretary General used a very graphic phrase. I think it was the opening line of his speech after the pleasantries. He said, "That sound that you hear is the ticking clock." As we tick towards 1.5, towards 2, towards 3 and 4 degrees and calamity. I think that message is starting to be heard. I just think we need to hurry up the process and hurry up the commitments behind it.
Yeah, and time moves clockwise.
Yes,
doesn't move
backwards.
Yeah. Amos, also a question here from Kevin Osido, who is the Executive Director of the County Governance Watch. He normally keeps an eye on what happens across the counties. He's asking the state of financing locally led climate action programs across the counties, the 47 units. And he said, we are undertaking a study at the finance locally led climate action projects in the counties 1 year since its launch. What's the status of this?
Yeah, at the Africa Climate Summit, there were funds that were committed to supporting locally led climate action, which is a good model. I might not be aware of how far that is. Probably the Ministry of Treasury with my colleague Odengo, who normally works on that, would be a good person to give us that update. But as we wind up, I think what the COPs, climate negotiations, have perfected is kicking the can down the road, making sure that these conversations continue into the next COP and next COP and next COP. I hope Baku is not going to do that. I hope Baku is going to provide us with a concrete plan, with a new goal that is going to help communities to be able to overcome the challenges of the crisis. Because as we are right now, we are in a climate emergency, and actions need to be as urgent, because when you are in an emergency, you have no time to waste.
Yes, Moses, the final word.
Also, to weigh in on the optimism, I believe that the new shape that the COP29 is taking is going to open doors for more. One of the viewers has indicated that perhaps this should be an agenda in the next AU sitting, and I believe it is now it's now possible to start having those kinds of conversations, as Dr. Jackson was saying, trusting in the multilateral process and the weight of having countries come up. And in fact, there are propositions of trying to have transnationally determined contributions, not necessarily nationally determined contributions, and they weigh in giving us more negotiating power when it comes to further COP arrangements. So,
gentlemen, lovely having you here on the broadcast. Dr. Stephen Jackson is the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Kenya. Thank you for your time, much appreciated. Moses Odhiambo, my immediate right, is the advocate and a lecturer. Amos Wemanya is the response campaign lead at Greenpeace Africa. Cecilia Njenga is the director at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She joined us from Baku in Azerbaijan, where that climate conference is happening. And thanks to you too for waking up with us here on the broadcast as this conference happens in Baku, Azerbaijan, where my colleagues Stephen Leto and Mashirima Kapombe are reporting from, given the prominent role Kenya will be playing as the chair of the African Group of Negotiators, as well as hosting the historic 2023 Africa Climate Summit here in Nairobi. President William Ruto will be represented by the Prime Cabinet Secretary, who is in the company of the Environment CS Adan Duale, and this is partly meant to secure for Africa and the Global South climate financing and the carbon market regulations. And they all believe, among the other parties as well, that this will be historic despite the notable absence of the global leaders, including President Biden and the presidents of France and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and notably the presence of the UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, who was present and committed the United Kingdom to this cause, having hosted the climate conference in 2021 in Glasgow in the UK. Thanks for waking up with us here on the broadcast. Up next is Safina Chieng Oma on health and lifestyle, and we'll see you tomorrow morning here on the State of the Nation. Till then, good morning.